Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining CPRA in our webinar today on reopening playgrounds and fields. My name is Krista Costas-Bradstreet. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships for the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. This is a 6-part series that we're doing, and we do have 3 more after this, which I'll tell you a little bit about at the end. But before we get started, what I would like to do is just give you a very quick introduction to CPRA, and then we'll move into our webinar for today. So Canadian Parks and Recreation Association is a national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as a major contributor to community health and vibrancy. Over our 60-year history, CPRA has been the national voice for parks and recreation, advancing the collective interests of our members. We are a national network dedicated to the well-being of people, communities, and the natural and built environments. And CPRA provides services for our members and partners that cultivate dialogue, learning, and innovation. In terms of our strengths, we really are the strength of all of our partners together. So we are a collective of 13 provincial and territorial associations. We are made up of a board of directors from each of those 13 provinces and territories, staff, volunteers, and we also work with government partners and our allied sectors, all who help us to move our strategic goals forward. We have a national office. We're all spread out through the country. We have a CEO, myself, a director of programs, director of communications, and an administrator, and that is MJ Akonde, and she helps me with these webinars as well. So she's on the line also. In terms of COVID-19, obviously an unprecedented situation for everybody, and so CPRA has really tried to support the sector in a number of ways. We have instituted weekly calls with all of our 13 provincial and territorial members, where we provide regional updates in terms of what's going on across the country and what the needs are of our sector. We've been monitoring, updating, and guiding federal government aid programs. We've been actively advocating the federal government for financial support for the sector. We're working with national partners to align advocacy efforts. We have a number of documents and different ideas and things and information that we're sharing on social media, and providing a number of tools to the sector, such as these webinars. And I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague now, Greg Cutler, who's also online and who you can see. And Greg is one of the members of our board of directors, and he's also the recreation coordinator for the city of St. John in New Brunswick. So thanks, Greg. I'll let you just do a quick welcome and just a little bit more on what CPRA is doing around the webinars.
Thank you very much. As Krista said, I am Greg Cutler, a proud member of the board of directors for CPRA. Happy to welcome everybody to this part of the webinar series. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day. Obviously, the information is very important, but also know everyone's busy, so thank you for being here. As Krista mentioned, this is a series. It basically came to us as a response to what we heard from the sector. So we thought it was important to listen to what people were looking for. So this is where it came from. A bit about the series. We wanted to recognize the diversity through the 13 provinces and territories. Obviously, things are different in each location, based on size, based on where your health restrictions are at the moment. So we wanted to give a general overview, and we think that everybody on the call today will maybe get something different, but everybody will be getting something important from the information they receive. And again, this is an ongoing information series. And I guess just to finish off, the current slide that we have now sort of shows an online portal that CPRA has available to our members and our sector. Again, hearing from what people in the sector were looking for, it's a spot where individuals can share their information on COVID, documents and resources, knowing that not everybody has the time or the interest in reinventing the wheel. So it's a spot for everyone in the sector to upload onto a Google shared drive important information so they can share with their colleagues across the country. And CPRA understands the importance of it, and are also developing this to, in the future, in the very short-term future, in a couple weeks, to have an online portal for other information as well, whether it's job postings, research. Again, just a way that everyone in the sector, we all work so well together. It's just a great way we can all share the information and can easily find it, and everyone can benefit from best practices across the country. So again, that's it for me. Basically, I want to say thank you and welcome. Krista, I'll turn it back over to you, and I know we have several speakers ready to go.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg. And thank your little one, Noah. I can hear Noah in the background. That's awesome. So Greg has a 6-month-old contributing to the webinar as well today. So thanks again.
As much to say as I do.
Yeah. And just to reiterate one of the points that Greg made around our COVID-19 site, we will be developing a more sophisticated site, as you mentioned. It should be up and running in the next 3 or 4 weeks. We're pretty excited about that. But in the meantime, please feel free to upload to this one if you have any resources and documents that you'd like to share. So I'd like to now turn the webinar over to our speakers. As you're listening to the speakers, we invite you to type your questions into the chat box. We will answer as many of them as we can during about the last 15 minutes of our webinar. And also, if there's some stories that you would like to share about what you're doing, please feel free to do that as well. We will be making the recording available after this webinar that you're welcome to share with your colleagues. And if there aren't questions that we get to, we will try our best to still answer them and get those back out to you as well. So first, I'd like to introduce Scott Belair. Scott has 25+ years of experience in the playground and play equipment field. Scott is a member of the Canadian Standards Association Technical Committee for Play Equipment and also a member of the American Society for Testing Materials. Scott is the principal instructor for the Canadian Playground Safety Institute, a certified playground inspector in both the US and Canada. He has published several articles, including some in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and has been a guest speaker nationally and internationally on topics of playground design and compliance with existing industry standards. So I'll send it over to you now, Scott. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. So it's a more impressive bio than I probably deserve. So internet connection, first off, sometimes for many of you, you'll be pros at webinar style training. Sometimes there can be a time lag, so just hang tight for 3 or 4 seconds if there is a lag. So largely be a one-way dialogue. I'm up first, we'll hang out, we'll take questions at the end. So just gonna talk a little bit about playgrounds and COVID. We'll go through closing all the way to opening. And so I think most of us know that it really shouldn't take a webinar for us, but for the public, most of our public is going to know that public areas and recreation areas are closed. What does closed mean? It is a lot easier to close a recreation facility or a swimming pool than it is to think of the concept of closing a playground. People throw that term around, and there really is not a foolproof method of closing. You know, anytime we put up things like temporary fencing or construction fence, all we would be doing is moving the commonly touched surface from the playground to the fence. Most people have chosen to put up caution tape. You know, for most of us, 99% of the population knows not to touch the playground or a public. Can you go back one, May, if you can? Yep, thanks. Knows not to touch a common surface anyhow, but for the remaining 1%, caution tape serves as a warning, maybe not so much as COVID, but we can look at this and say, hey, there's something going on there. And then I think the big one is having signage. You can see the 2 examples on the left say playgrounds closed. Now, when I think of closed, I think of a grocery store with the doors locked. This is really more of a warning, but it tells us to stay apart. On the right, a social media tweet that's from a different community in Canada. Those can be great, and they can be great as an added bonus, but you know, should not be used solely. And a lot of people don't have access to social media, don't have access to the internet. So certainly signage is the best way to convey this information. Caution tape seems to be the most reasonable course of action, but I also don't want to give the perception that that is actually closed. It's really just a warning. May, if you can click to the next one if you can. So this is about as good as it gets without actually getting up close and reading the sign. So the sign on the right is posted at 3 locations on that playground. As you get closer, you can see it, but the caution tape alone tells me, hey, there's something wrong here. As I get closer, I can see the sign, and this is great. If you go one more, May, here is what we don't want to have. And again, for 99% of the population, they shouldn't even need the caution tape. But as many of you that work in Parks and Recreation know, the lowest common denominator of the public can be pretty low. And so for people, and sometimes it can be English as a second language, they may not be able to read the sign. So if we're just looking at the caution tape, these are all photos from the same playground. And so we can see in the top three, we see caution tape. Along the bottom row in the same place, I may look at this and say, hey, listen, the whale spring toy is open. There's no caution tape. The spring toy in the center photo is closed with caution tape, and the sandbox on the right looks open. So making sure that when we do close equipment, that all the equipment gets treated the same way with signage at multiple locations at multiple access points. May, can you go one more if you can? And so when we do get to reopen, follow the advice of public health professionals. Let's not make this decision internally within our organization. Reopening is getting treated differently across the country. In the West Coast, it seems like people are cutting the caution tape off and having at it. I'm sure Neil will get to that. Out east, there is a public health recommendation to sanitize play equipment twice a day. Whatever those public health professionals recommend to do, that is what we should do. We do know that most people show symptoms within 5 to 6 days. 99% show symptoms within 14 days, which is the rationale for the 14-day quarantine. On public surfaces, COVID can last 72 hours. And then because of the closure, most playgrounds haven't been touched in 3+ months. So when these do get reopened, the biggest challenge is going to be maintenance, lubricating swing bearings, track rides, moving parts, making sure the equipment is sort of quote unquote safe. And then after we reopen, the trick will be then how to keep those surfaces clean. And so again, when we do take down our caution tape or whatever it is we've done, leaving up those social or physical distancing signs, telling people that if there is someone at that site to continue on to the next playground down the road, and then following the advice of public health professionals. There is no requirement to sanitize play equipment. If you are required to sanitize, we'll go through a few tips here, but there is an article on the CPSI website on how to sanitize everything from soap and water right through to which chemicals are acceptable. And you can go there and find out more details. May, can you click one more forward if you can? So soap and water of any temperature is effective against COVID. Hot water can be effective against other types of germs and stuff that we may want to sanitize off of the equipment, but room temperature soap and water is effective against COVID. There's not even a need necessarily to sanitize, again, following the advice of public health professionals. Mother Nature does a pretty good job outside. Many of you have probably already read that the risk of transmission indoor is far greater than that outdoor. But again, if you are required to sanitize, regular soap and water can do it. May, if you go one more forward, I will suggest that a power washer is a bad idea. It may make surfaces look cleaner, but it can damage equipment. So you can see in the bottom two photos, some of those PVC or plastisol coatings on playgrounds. If you get water from a power washer in there, it can cause damage to the equipment and can make your situation worse. Harsh chemicals are not needed. Again, we don't want harsh chemicals where kids have access. And also, again, not only can it give kids access to those chemicals, it can decay the equipment. Do you want to go one more, May? Some important points to make. Surfaces that, again, when we do reopen, we want to think about regular inspection and maintenance with our playground maintenance policies. Once we do reopen, we want to warn to have the users sanitize the equipment before and after, clean their face, hands, whatever. I've heard some people try to put sanitizing stations out in parks. I don't think they're going to last. So put that onus back on the parent, caregiver, or user. Again, noting that commonly used cleaners and disinfectants are effective against COVID. There's no need to use harsh chemicals. Leave social or physical distancing signage up. And again, if you are required to sanitize, you can visit the CPSI website for an article on how to do that. Again, regular room temperature, soap and water, or harsh chemicals only after consulting with the manufacturer of the equipment. And if you want to go one more. And that is the end. Again, I will hang out and take questions at the end. I will turn it over back to the next speaker, or Krista. I'm not sure who's up next.
Me. Thanks, Scott. Thank you so much. So I would like to introduce you to our next speaker, Neil Avon. Neil is the manager of parks at the City of Surrey, leading a team of over 200 staff in the delivery of the full range of park services, from long-range planning, strategic land acquisition, and biodiversity conservation, to conceptual and detailed design and construction, and through operations and maintenance of all park amenities, including outdoor sport facilities, feature gardens, Surrey Nature Center, and the city's urban forests. Thanks so much, Neil, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Krista. Good morning from the West Coast, everyone. I'm Neil, and I'm pleased to be here this morning to share a little bit about what Surrey's been doing in regards to playgrounds and fields in our parks. Next slide. Quick and easy. So first, I thought I'd share a bit of a background on some of our planning during this COVID period, and what you're looking at is just a screenshot of the title page of our, what we're calling our proactive 10-point action plan in Surrey. And we developed this 10-point action plan. Version 1 was in early April, and it was intended to proactively mitigate and suppress the impacts of COVID-19 and guide the day-to-day actions of our emergency response during the pandemic. And if you go to Surrey's website and you go to our COVID page, you'll be able to find that 10-point action plan there for you. Happy to share it if that's a desire as well. But the framework of that 10-point action plan has the 10 key elements, and one is a commitment of our local government to leadership in this. Number 2 is activating an emergency response center, which we did in early February. Number 3 is ensuring the safety and well-being of our employees and citizens. Number 4 is implement and monitor guidelines on non-essential gatherings and facility access. Number 5 is ready our local economy for recovery. Number 6 is support regional and provincial public health needs. Number 7 is implement a 3-level plan for critical and essential services that the city delivers. And number 8 is communicate clearly and often to our employees, citizens, and partners. Number 9, coordinate with other public agencies across the city. And forecast future scenarios to determine how to minimize impact and aid recovery is number 10. And so that's our overall guiding framework that is guiding, of course, all of our city actions right now, and of course in our parks, recreation, and culture services, programs, and amenities as well. And so today I'll share with you how we've worked through reopening with playgrounds and fields as a couple of examples. Next slide. So our playgrounds in Surrey, and that picture isn't a good example because that's not actually a picture of a closed playground, but we closed our playgrounds on March 23rd. And as Scott touched on, a typical action, we posted signage and we installed caution tape. And MJ, if you go to the next slide, there's a quick picture of what the signage looks like. It's quite simple. And then accompanying caution tape on all the play elements around playgrounds was certainly a key part of it. And then, of course, many folks continue to utilize playground areas, and so we certainly worked hard to revisit our playgrounds and ensure that the caution tape was in place. We had to regularly redo it. I guess I could take a step back here and mention that we have 125 playgrounds in our city parks in Surrey, and so it's no small effort for staff to continually revisit those sites. Next, oh, you're already on the slide, MJ, thanks. No, go back, please, thank you. Okay, so to support BC's restart plan and the reopening of city facilities and the resumption of our services, we prepared a decision matrix, and this is embedded within our 10-point action plan as well, that helps us determine when each of the city's functional business areas are able to adjust their service level and resume some form of operation. And these 4 criteria are the critical elements that must be met. ability to comply with the provincial health order, reasonable public demand for the service, financial viability, and public and employee safety measures are in place. Next slide. So as we prepared to reopen our amenities and programs, the city developed a detailed facility reopening approval document. I don't expect that you'll be able to read that on your screen. I'd be happy to share it with anyone who's interested after the session for sure. And so this detailed facility reopening document and an accompanying process ensures that the key elements and those decision-making criteria are followed and approved by all appropriate levels within our organization here at the city. Some key section within this reopening document, it starts off with a description of the services offered, including the planned percentage level of programming. So in the case of playgrounds, for us, in our case, it was 100%. We were opening all of them at the same time. And then information that supports how this service complies with the provincial health office. There's a section on the analysis of expected public demand, and then financial impact and authorization from finance to proceed. Description of the public and employee safety measures that are in place, including training and signage that might be in place. We have a section in there that confirms that we have staff availability to carry out the service. As with, I think, many municipalities, we did see some layoffs, particularly in our recreation teams. So that step is to ensure that we've got sufficient staff to carry out the service that we are proposing. Another section is a communication plan that really is about internal communication that helps to mitigate workforce anxiety. It's about education for employees and training and updated work procedures. So we need to make sure we've got all those pieces in place as well. And not finally, but one of the key pieces is an actual statement of recommendation to our EOC, which is our Emergency Operations Center. And so within this particular document, we would say, staff are recommending that the city reopen all of our public playgrounds. And then second to last piece of this document is a description of ongoing monitoring reporting. So once we open up these facilities, how do we ensure that appropriate actions are in place still, the signage is still up, that people are generally abiding by the public health regulations. And finally, as you can see at the bottom of that page, there is a whole bunch of signatures. So those are those key signatures that we require to have on those documentations. And once that's all signed off, we can then direct staff to carry out our opening. And so, MJ, next slide. This was the signage that we had developed and posted on our playgrounds. And our reopening of 125 playgrounds occurred this year on June 1st. And that was in coordination with the Surrey School District. They were reopening to optional in-class instruction on June 1st, and accordingly, they also opened up their playgrounds on the same day. So there was certainly, within the city, there was coordination among the city and the school district, but there was also some regional coordination in the Metro Vancouver area here. We had been carrying out our monthly playground inspections throughout the period of closure. So our regular safety inspections that Scott was talking about in terms of ensuring that everything was greased and wheeled and safe to operate. We've been doing that throughout the sort of 3 months that playgrounds were closed. And so we were pretty ready to open when we were given the go-ahead. It was a relatively simple process where we removed all our closure signage, replaced it with this new signage, and then removed, of course, the caution tape that we had in place. Another key element for us in reopening playgrounds has been what we're calling our Park Ambassador program. We implemented that in early April as a program at our busiest park locations to interact and engage with the park visitors who were there, to educate and remind them of the physical distancing measures that they have to adhere to. So the park ambassadors have been and remain a very important part of our reopening program in parks. especially at our busiest destination locations. In addition, the city deployed a COVID-19 compliance and enforcement team. Again, this was early on in the pandemic, and this is made up of bylaws officers and RCMP. And that COVID compliance team responds to complaints related to public health order violations, whether that's in a business like a restaurant or anywhere, a community hall or any sort of building, and in parks. And so they actively respond to concerns that are reported. They provide education to residents and businesses regarding their responsibilities, and they support our park ambassadors when requested, because of course our park ambassadors, while they're clearly identified as city staff, they don't necessarily have the same presence and authority that a bylaws officer or an RCMP officer would have. Next slide. So sports fields, just shift gears a little bit. In Surrey, we have 15 artificial turf fields. We have about 101 sports fields, depending on how you count overlap, and we have 95 ball diamonds. Our sports fields were open for casual use through the entire COVID-19 response period. Casual use meaning individual play, small family groups could get together and kick a ball around or throw a frisbee or do laps if they wanted to. And so that was our approach right away. And if you go to the next slide, MJ, this was the signage that was posted at the beginning of the COVID response period way back in March. So essentially acknowledging that people will still be using our sports fields, but highlighting that they need to stay home if they're sick, keep a distance from one another, avoid crowds and gatherings, and no organize your team activities. Next slide. So similar to playgrounds and all other reopenings here at the city, we went through this process of completing a facility reopening approval document and the whole process, and I won't go into any more detail there because you heard it earlier. And the result, of course, is that we, next slide, MJ, that we opened our playgrounds, our playgrounds, we already opened our playgrounds. We have resumed issuing permits for sports fields as of June 17th, so it's been just over a week. And a great deal of interagency work was involved in the process in order to get to the stage where we can issue permits to our local sport organizations, including our provincial BCRPA, an organization called Via Sport, along with the provincial sport organizations like BC Soccer or Softball BC, and of course the local sport organizations, and of course public health authorities and city as well had to all cooperate to make this happen. So those local sport organizations who can demonstrate that they've got a COVID-19 safety plan in place and approved through their appropriate governing body can then contact the city and seek a permit to return to play. And that return to play as it stands right now is primarily focused on individual skills in a team setting. And that's where we stand as of today. Next slide. I think that's it. All right, thank you for your time, and I'll be sticking around if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Neil. That was great. And just as Neil mentioned, and I think Scott as well, that we will be taking questions at the end. So please, I invite you to type your questions into the chat box. The presentation will be made available after the webinar, so you will receive that as well. So I'd like to introduce our final speaker. Randy Byrne has been the Executive Director of Baseball PEI for the past 5.5 years. He's been involved in baseball as either a player, coach, association board member, president, and executive director since he was 5 years old. He calls St. Peters Bay PEI home. We're especially thrilled that Randy's here today because he's waiting patiently for the birth of his third child as we speak. So speak quickly, mister. No, you've got lots of time, I hope. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Krista. So just kind of a forward before I get started here. The two presenters previous are kind of talking more on the hands-on as far as facilities. My job as executive director, I'm more of an administrator, so I in my role, I set the rules for teams and leagues, and I worked with our local CPHO, or Chief Public Health Office, and municipalities to get fields ready and get teams ready. So my presentation will be slightly different, but I think it should be of use to you. Next slide, MJ. So just a little background. PEI, COVID-19 hit PEI quite a bit differently than some other places in the country. So from the time things shut down in mid-March until now, we've only had 27 cases of COVID-19 on Prince Edward Island. And the last case was roughly 2 months ago. Nobody was hospitalized, and in all cases have recovered. So I give you that information so that you're aware that we are ahead on a few things than some other jurisdictions, obviously. So I guess in mid-May, the CPHO and the provincial government came out with a Renew PEI Together plan about slowly reopening up facilities, businesses, economy, that sort of thing. And on the 1st of June, organized sports teams could play. Now, that there was a restriction of that, of course, that there was only a maximum of 20 people permitted in an organized sporting outdoor gathering. And that's the situation we're in right now until, what's today, Thursday? Tomorrow, actually, phase 4 kicks in, and we can up that number to 50. So starting on June 1st, obviously we allowed our associations and teams on the field, and they started basically tryouts, practices, and that sort of thing. No, I'll say normal games, you know, a 9-on-9 game were permitted because you'd be over the number of 20. Starting tomorrow, when that number bumps up to 50, exhibition games will be permitted to be played, and our leagues are actually starting on next Monday, the 29th of June. Now, in order to stay within these limits, we've had to create rules around sports, baseball fields and complexes. So, for example, in phase 3 here, where we're at 20 people, only basically players and coaches are permitted at the field. Parents have to stay in the car, and coaches have to make sure that between themselves and players, they're at the number of 20. Now, when the number goes up to 50 tomorrow, we had to put in rules to make sure that we stayed around the number of 50, either 50 or below. So we spoke to our local associations, we spoke to municipalities, park and recs departments, and basically we kind of came up with a plan that for games, all players are permitted to be at the field. All coaches are permitted to be at the field. 2 extra team staff for teams, is somebody to do scorekeeping and pitch count, and then one parent per child for the away team, and that caused a little bit of I wouldn't say animosity or anything like that, but there's some people disappointed that only one parent was permitted, and just the parents of the away team at that game. But if we allowed one parent for every player, home and away teams, we couldn't guarantee that would be under the number of 50. So that's why we put that rule in place. Now, when we started this process on the 1st of June, we had to follow the guidelines of the CPHO. So we really followed what the CPHO and the provincial government gave to us. We took their restrictions, rules, guidelines, and put that into play to work for us. So, for example, we created signage, and I don't have a picture here, but we created signage based on a recommendation from the CPHO that is posted at every field across PEI, with just reminding people that if they're ill, to please stay home, and if they demonstrate any symptoms of COVID-19, to please leave the ballpark and go home. And we actually had to list those symptoms. Also, most of our fields on PEI are fairly wide open, in the sense that you can access the field and dugout without going through, you know, a concourse or entry or bleachers. But facilities that requires you to go through, an entry and exit point just to get to the field or get to the bleachers, those associations and those municipalities had to create operational plans about clear entrance and exits from those facilities. You know, people couldn't exit through an entrance, that sort of thing. As well, facilities with multiple fields, they had to have an operational plan as well. And we really worked with associations and municipalities, you know, based on the rules and recommendations from the CPO to create that. Next slide, MJ, please. So I'm going to give you some requirements of the teams at the fields, just to give you a sense of kind of our thought process and how we approach this. Obviously, anybody who is ill are not permitted to be at the fields, and anybody who's been in contact with somebody ill shouldn't be there. And we really emphasize that point. What people would consider traditional activities involved with baseball, so chewing gums, sunflower seeds, spitting, for example, are not permitted, whether it's a game or practice or training. And we have rules when our games start that if somebody licks their hand, for example, and pitchers you'll see often do that in the mound, or blow in their hands on a cold day, the game will be stopped and they have to go sanitize their hands. We limit the sharing of gear as much as possible, and if it does have to be shared, it should be disinfected between uses. All teams at the end of a session, whether it's a practice or a game, they're responsible to sanitize high touch areas in the dugout. So, for example, benches, hooks, the top of the fence people may be leaning on, etc. And the reason we came to that conclusion is that I would say a quarter of the fields in Prince Edward Island aren't maintained by a local municipality. It's just a volunteer group, maybe in a rural area, and if we tasked Parks and Rec employees to clean those dugouts, for example, it wouldn't happen. So we put that responsibility onto the teams. We've also limited the number of people allowed in dugouts, because if you have a team of 12 players and 3 or 4 coaches, obviously you can't properly physically distance yourselves in the dugout. So once you exceed the number of people you can safely physically distant in a dugout, everybody else has to be along the fence outside the dugout. Next slide, MJ, please. So there was a real major discussion amongst provincial baseball associations earlier about sanitizing baseballs, and I know some provinces, their public health authorities said that that would be necessary. However, on PEI, and I'll say quite fortunately, our CPHO deemed that it's really not possible to sanitize a baseball properly and have it so that you can use it within, let's say, the next 2 hours, because anybody with familiarity with baseball will know a ball gets waterlogged fairly quickly, and it's just not possible. So what we've done is when each player comes off the field each inning, they have to supply their own hand sanitizer, and they have to sanitize their hands after the end of each inning. As well as in games, each team will supply 4 baseballs, and only a team will touch those baseballs. So what I mean by that is when a team is pitching and on defense, they will use their 4 baseballs, and then when the other team goes on the field next inning to pitch and play defense, they use their own 4 baseballs, and nobody else is supposed to touch it. So we're just trying to limit the number of people touching baseballs. Any facilities that have bathrooms or canteens, unless they can be properly cleaned, they're to be shut down. And I know some larger associations with facilities, they've really increased the number of cleaning, or if they haven't felt that's possible, they've closed these. Teams have to keep a log of, you know, all players, coaches, and people at the field in case somebody was ever to test positive for COVID-19 and contact tracing had to take place. Now that responsibility is technically to the facility, but that being said, we felt it would be easier for our teams to do that than, let's say, the city of Summerside, who operate maybe 3 fields at Queen Elizabeth Park. We kind of already talked about people allowed at the field. Next slide, MJ, please. So we talked about game rules here a little bit already, and kind of their relation to the fields and facilities. Players' hand can't go towards their mouth. We've any kind of situations that lead to breaking of physical distancing, we've kind of eliminated for the most part. Like, for example, there's no play meetings before the game. Umpires call balls and strikes behind the pitcher, and they're not parked directly behind the catcher as is usual. We've eliminated mound visits for the catchers and coaches. So if a coach wants to change their pitcher, they can go as far as the foul line, announce the change, and then go back to the dugout. There's no post-game handshakes. We've asked people to refrain from high fives, fist bumps, that certain thing. Coaches can't go on the field to argue calls. That being said, we still have some circumstances in our games that might lead to the breaking of physical distancing, like on a tag play or something of that nature. And we've been deemed that's acceptable because they're brief exchanges. But that being said, we try to eliminate that as much as possible. And if a player, for example, had to apply a tag, once they make the tag, they get out of Dodge as quickly as possible. Next slide, MJ, please. We made a little change as well, and this affected recreation employees. In softball, they had the safety base where there's a white base in foul territory and orange base in fair territory. When possible, we're asking for those to be adopted in baseball for purposes of physical distancing. And we've already talked about players sanitizing their hands after they come up the field each inning, and the 4 baseballs for each team, and they use those only when they're on the field. Next slide, MJ, please. So as far as how easy some of these things are to implement for recreation departments, for the most part, once they created their operational plan and they've, created entry and exit points and put up signage and made that clear, we've really kind of helped them, in our opinion, to enforce a lot of the rules and guidelines from the CPHO. Now, from my end, from my point of view, people have been doing a really good job in PEI following our rules and the rules of the CPHO around COVID-19. We do foresee maybe some issues, to be honest, when we start having games and the number of people allowed at a field is 50 or fewer, because if you're not a player or coach or that designated parent of the away team, you have to either drop your child off at the field and then come back later, pick them up, or watch from your car. And we're a little worried that some parents are just going to ignore that and go watch at the field. And so we've really been working with associations to remind people to follow those rules and to make sure that they don't break them, or maybe the CPHO will have to put sanctions on us. And the reality is, with so few cases here as well, and it's been such a long time since there's a case, a lot of people maybe not as vigilant about physical distancing as they once were. So we're trying to remind people that even though you're at the ballpark at a game, still we want you to remain as physically distant from others as possible and observe our rules. So there's been lots of reminders to remain vigilant, and we know that will have to continue throughout the season. So anyway, that's my presentation, and thank you very much for listening. And I guess I'll let Krista come in now.
Thank you so much, Randy. And actually, I'll invite all of our speakers to come back on. And just to now provide an opportunity for people to ask questions. I don't see any in the chat box yet. I do have one. And also, if there is anybody on the call who wanted to provide an update about what you're doing to reopen any of your playgrounds or fields, please feel free to let us know, and we will attempt to turn it over to you to share that with us. But so maybe I will just start with Neil and ask, you had mentioned how you had some great cooperation with your sport organizations, and it was great to have Randy's perspective on, from baseball's point of view. Was there a process that you guys undertook to bring the sports together to talk about how the fields were going to be opened up? Like, how did that all come about? Because we're hearing across the country, sometimes it's working well, other times it's a challenge. Working with sports who want to get underway, but it's the facilities that they need, or the fields that they need.
Right. Yeah, I would say that our local sport organizations were they've been clamoring for a long time to get back to some form of play. And certainly there were a couple of clubs in particular, some of our larger soccer clubs were the leaders in reaching out to the city to say, hey, we want to get this going. But we, the city, understood that there was work going on at the provincial level that would provide these overarching guidelines for all provincial amateur sports. And so we sort of had to just wait and see for those guidelines to come. And then, I do understand that some of our local sport organizations worked with, and they actually led their provincial sport organizations in developing the guidelines for their sport. And then once we had that in place, one of the last hurdles was figuring out the insurance aspect. And here in British Columbia, the province issued a ministerial order that essentially exempts amateur sport organizations from any liability during this emergency period. So it gave that bit of a comfort level that, from both the city perspective and the local sport organizations who's got volunteers and even paid staff and others to be able to proceed. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of collaboration, and my staff continue to work daily as other sports bring things forward, whether it's cricket or softball or slow pitch or volleyball. All those groups are starting to bring their plans forward, and it's busy right now for sure since June 17th last week, and we're even starting to see similar to what Randy was talking about is modified game proposals. So right now, the message is it's all about practicing individual skills in your team environment, staying 2 meters apart. But certainly we're starting to see some modified game plans for slow pitch or cricket that as those get approved at their organizational levels, we'll be considering those as well for permitting in the coming weeks.
Awesome, thanks, Neil. There is another question, so I think this one's for Randy. Would players be allowed to use a communal water cooler? And if not, are they using their own water bottles, not shared, of course?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually it's funny, on PEI, being a smaller jurisdiction, there aren't any fields I'm aware of where there are communal water coolers in the facility or the dugout. So we really didn't have to worry about that. I know from playing and coaching in other provinces that a lot of facilities and fields do. That being said, each player has to supply their own water bottle, and players are not permitted to share water bottles at this time.
Great, thanks. Neil, can you speak to the cleaning process for artificial turf during the pandemic and then permitting stage?
Sorry, did you say cleaning process?
Yeah, cleaning process for artificial turf.
Sure. Well, our cleaning process has been rain. No, so as our sport groups are now permitted to utilize, well, let me back up and say that most of our outdoor sport, our local sport organizations are using our grass fields in the interim period here as we've started return to play. And that's because our grass fields, we don't have a permit, it's the right word, a permit fee for that. Whereas our artificial turf fields, we associate a fee with the use of that field. So local organizations, in order to save money and be fiscally responsible, not knowing how many of their members will be coming back necessarily in these early days, they certainly have focused their activities on our grass fields that are free. So
Krista, if I can just piggyback on that, our artificial turf or sport turf gets used in playgrounds and other numerous sports facilities. And I think, as Neil alluded to, outdoor Mother Nature does a really good job with not just turf, but everything. But I think the big things to watch out for would be, if it's indoor, you'd be in a different scenario, and the bigger one would be infill. So there is a shock absorbency threshold for a sports field or a playground. There are different thresholds, but it has that. You often have infill, which you can imagine, whether it's a playground or a sports field, you want that field to be resilient and padded, but not so padded that it is cushiony and you get people rolling ankles and whatever else. And so often if there's an infill, you can't do much in terms of power washing without disturbing the infill and then creating a safety issue by removing the infill, which would have maintained the the impact rating that would be required. So I think the big thing would be refer back to your manufacturer before you do anything. They may be able to say, hey, we recommend you power wash, or we don't recommend you power wash, or pick every single particle out manually with you. I'm kidding with that part, but they will be the best insight on how to do that. But I think the big things would be indoor versus outdoor, and beware if you have an infill, like a sand infill or a rubber infill or all that kind of stuff, because there's a lot of caveats beyond just COVID.
Yeah, that's a great point, Scott. And certainly we're not cleaning or sanitizing our sports fields. The local sport organizations and their COVID safety plans may include some information, like when we line kids up against a fence and they're 2 meters apart. If they happen to touch the fence, we have to do a wipe down. They may have those sorts of things built into their plans. So it's about touch points and how do we go through gates to get into those sports fields, things like that. That's where cleaning would occur, and we would put that on the sport organizations to make sure that they're doing that.
Awesome, thank you. Randy, do you have an example of a waiver that you'll be using that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. We have there's 3 different forms that we have created for basically, well, for normal insurance purposes, but kind of modified for COVID-19. A waiver for any players, umpires, coaches over the age of 18, an assumption of risk for athletes under the age of 18, because we are told by our legal folks that somebody under the age of 18 can't legally sign a waiver, and a parent can't sign their rights away. So the parent and player sign the assumption of risk. Everybody has to sign a declaration of compliance, which means they won't show up to the field or any baseball PEI activities if they show any the symptoms of COVID-19 or any illness. So yeah, I can definitely share those with you.
Okay, that's great, and then we'll make sure they get out to everybody. And Neil, also a question around sharing your Surrey facility reopening document. Is that something that you would be able to do?
Yeah, definitely I can share those.
Okay. So again, we'll make those available to everybody when we send the link out for this recording. Another question, did you make any changes to your rental contracts with sporting groups? If so, what did that include? So I'm thinking that's for you, Neil.
Sure, yeah, so just like Randy was talking about an assumption of risk form, we developed that and with our risk management office, and I think regionally or across BC, the various risk managers at cities worked collectively to try and develop this addendum that we do attach to our facility booking permits.
Thank you. Sorry, I put myself on mute. I'm up at a cottage and I think there's a power boat going by. So no crying baby, but power boats or something. Another question, are you relying solely on the sport organization's insurance coverage on your outdoor facilities, or does your insurance cover these activities on your outdoor facilities?
As I understand it, and I'm not an insurance expert, but as I understand it, here in the province of BC, we have our Municipal Insurance Association of BC, and the current coverage covers our current pandemic state. And I think I heard that it expires at the end of 2020, and so we'll have to see what happens after that. But municipalities in Surrey have coverage. And because of this ministerial order that I mentioned before, amateur sport organizations also are exempt from any liability.
Awesome. And I think a last question for Scott. What are the sources of information for viruses remaining on surfaces?
There are a bazillion if you do a Google search, but if you're looking for, well, I'm going to call it specific to playgrounds, but would cover any outdoor surface. So if you go to the CPSI online, so www.cpsionline.ca website, I think if you click on resources and links, there's an article, and that article would then refer down, I believe it's Health Canada, but it could be canada.ca, that gives a recommendation on how long germs and viruses would last on commonly touched surfaces, ranging from plastics to steel, what you can do and all that kind of stuff. But it is a eventually that article will refer you back to the Government of Canada, whether it's Health Canada or Canada.ca, and it will give direction on if you are required to sanitize. And again, we talked about Mother Nature doing it, but if you are required to sanitize on a mixture of bleach to water to dilute it, and that will refer you to the government website on how to get that mixture correct.
Awesome. I think this will probably be the final question, but how are outdoor washrooms or porta potties sanitization being handled, specifically at playgrounds? So that might be for any of the three of you, probably Neil or Scott, if you want to start.
Sure, I can start. In Surrey, as I said, we have 125 playgrounds across our park system. Many of them are at sites where there are no washrooms. They're in little neighborhood parks that people would be expected to walk home and use their own washroom. So certainly in those sites, there's no washroom cleaning happening. But for the rest of our sites where we have existing washroom facilities, we have a whole matrix of our cleaning frequencies that we would normally do under normal conditions. And we've essentially increased those for all washroom types and all park types across our system. So in our busiest parks, our cleaning is happening, say, twice daily in washrooms, whereas in more quieter parks where our normal cleaning was maybe once a week, maybe we're doing that 3 times a week, something like that.
Yep, and I think
Great.
just to echo that, everywhere I have run across, porta potties have been taken away in public spaces, and any constructed washrooms or public washrooms, regular or as directed by public health professionals on how to sanitize regularly.
Right, and I guess I should follow up and just say that we do have signage posted on all our washroom facilities, and some of them in particular at our sort of more remote parks that are, maybe they're not flush toilets at all, right? No running water. We do have information on the signage that says there's no hand sanitizer available here.
All right. Well, thank you to all of you for the great presentations and also for the questions and answers. There were a lot there, so really informative today. I'll just wrap up with our last slide on our next set of webinars. So this, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a series of 6 webinars. This is the 3rd. Our 4th one will be held, we're just confirming the date, but I'm looking at July 8th. And that will be focusing on programming in multi-use facilities, so reopening multi-use facilities and the programming involved. So again, right now it's tentatively set for July 8th at noon Eastern time. For more information, you can see the website that you can visit. So it's the CPRA website and specifically at webinars. We also host a number of other webinars throughout various topics throughout the year, and we have a new series on women and gender equity in recreational sport. Again, if you visit our website, you'll find more information on those. The next one, I believe, is the week of October 8th. And again, wanted to just remind everybody that the webinars are recorded. So if you have some other, if you want to listen to it again, or if you want to pass that on and share the link with your colleagues, we invite you to do that. We will also make sure that you get the documents that you were asking about, as well as the presentation today. And I think that's it for us. So again, I just wanted to take a last opportunity. Neil, did you have another point?
May I just say that I don't know what your process would be, but if anybody has specific email, a question they want to ask, they're welcome to, if you can share my email address, I'd be happy. It's fine with me.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you. All right, so if anybody has any additional questions, yeah, we can either get you some emails, or if you want to send them to us, we'll be happy to share them with our speakers today for some answers. So you can reach me through or MJ through the CPRA website as well. So I think it's info@cpra.ca. You're welcome to share your questions. So again, just wanted to thank Randy, Neil, and Scott for excellent presentations, and to you all today for spending time with us. And I hope that we'll see you again and have an amazing day today. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.